Now, I have done many collaborations with many IEM brands at this point, and every time I release a new collaboration product, there is a line of reasoning that I've seen quite often, and that is, why is Crinacle doing so many collabs? He should just start his own IEM company. And my typical reaction to that is, bitch, what? Do you have any inkling of how hard it is to make your own IEM brand? And as soon as I thought this, I realized that no, most people don't know how hard it is. So I figured, in all Crinacle fashion, let me explain. And before we proceed any further, let's just talk about our sponsor, Linsol. Yes, this is an ad read. Navigating the online Chi-Fi world can be a bit of a daunting process. After all, there are so many retailers, so many sellers, you're absolutely spoiled for choice, and to a point where you just simply don't know who to trust. Here, allow me to introduce you to Linsol, one of the oldest players in the online Chi-Fi retail space. With an extensive catalog of headphones, IEMs, DACs, and amplifiers, you can be sure to get the absolute best bang for your buck out of their catalog. And even more than that, they ship virtually everywhere and for free. So what are you waiting for? Go to linsol.com, tell them I sent you, support the people who support me. For those of you who don't want to listen to me ramble on and on, the simple answer is yes. It is quite hard to make your own IEM brand / IEM company. But why? Let's put it kind of to rest that making your own IEM full stop is actually fairly easy. There's actually quite a large community built around kind of DIYing your own IEMs. If you go down to HeadFi, there is a thread called Homemade IEMs, and it is an absolute repository of how to make your IEMs, typically with BA drivers. So if you really wanted to, and if you're willing to learn, it actually isn't that much of rocket science, really. All you need is just a very basic understanding of electronics in general, how to solder, how to put tubes into a shell, I guess. And if you're kind of starting out with a single driver configuration, it's even easier. All you have to do is just literally hook up a driver, put it into a shell, and you got yourself an IEM. So making the IEM itself actually isn't that difficult. You can DIY it with maybe a few tens of hours of experience and learning, and that's about it. The problem is, how do you produce an IEM? How do you have an actual production line for an IEM? So here's the thing, you could be a one-man team for quite a while. Many of the big IEM brands that you know today actually started out as one-man teams that DIY'd for very, very small volumes. Two of the more recent examples that I can think of now would be VadFreak, who started out with reshelling custom IEMs and then thereafter started out with their own line of products, or even Elysian Acoustic Labs, who now make some of the best IEMs on the planet, but started out as a one-man team doing everything himself. You could very well do this, but the biggest issue with this whole business model is A, clearly the volume, and B, the price. Because you see, as a one-man team, you simply do not have enough economies of scale to do anything that is more than a few $100s. The simple fact of the matter is, at those volumes, we're talking like maybe under 100 units a month, you are going to be paying out your nose for even the simplest components available. So even a simple, let's say 3 or 4 driver IEM, which the Chinese will be able to make for, let's say, $50, as a sole DIYer, you would have to charge like 200, 300, even more than that just to make ends meet. But the IEM industry is a scam. They're charging so much more than their material costs. There's something wrong. Bitch, do you even know how businesses work? Let's just talk about the restaurant industry as a very relatable example. Do you really think that what you're eating at a restaurant is simply the ingredient cost plus maybe $1 or $2? No! The typical restaurant industry gross margin is actually about 70%. That means that for whatever dish that you just ordered, only really 30% of it goes into the ingredient cost. Some of you with zero business sense would think that this is a ripoff, but there are so many other kinds of hidden costs that you don't actually see in that price. For example, rental, the kitchen costs, servers, marketing, all the list goes on. So by the time all of these costs get accounted for at the end of every month, your typical restaurant industry actual profit margin is 5 to 10%. It's really not a lot. I say this because it's kind of the same in the IEM industry, the audio industry, really any industry in general. So as a sole DIYer, I'm still in this whole like DIY business model for now. There are still other kinds of costs that you have to account for before you set the price of your eventual product. For example, who's paying for the first batch of, let's say, BA drivers? Who's paying for the shell costs? Who's paying for labor costs? Who's paying for the rental of the place that you're going to be building IEMs in? So you could say that, oh, this DIYer is building this thing for about, let's say, $100 in raw material costs. He should only be charging like $110 or $120 for this IEM. But the world doesn't work that way. Again, what's typically realistic is you're going to take what costs maybe $100 to build and maybe upcharge it by triple, maybe $300. And I would say even at this point, it might not even cover all the costs specifically as a DIYer. Because on top of just material costs, there are also other things. For example, if you're using a shell, you need some way to glue the faceplate and the shell together. What you're gonna use, you need to pay for the resin. You need to pay for the UV resin, as well as the UV machine that comes with it. And that's not even accounting for things like cables or the ear tips, things that you as a DIYer are not gonna be able to buy for cheap because you're gonna be buying them at relatively low volumes. So as a DIYer, the things that would cost a Chinese factory maybe cents on the dollar to make, you would have to pay tens to maybe even 100 times more just to get it to you. So yes, going the DIY route is going to be the easiest way to start a brand or a company. But at that point, your products are going to have to be very, very expensive and unfortunately not going to be the best value for money unless you can make the best IEMs on that budget, which is why you see a lot of the upcoming brands that aren't from China typically have to price their IEMs really, really high because they have to account for A, not very cheap labor costs, and B, just high prices of raw materials in general. And look, I would love to come up with a very, very expensive IEM for my first product, but let's all face it, you don't want that. So then what is the solution here? Well, you could make something cheap through a factory, right? So here's the biggest question. What factory? Who? What? Where? Huh? There's so many questions that need to be answered before you even dive deep into making an IEM company. So let's say I want to make something out of a factory. Then the question becomes, what factory? Because I'm pretty sure none of you want me to go with someone like KZ. So then there is that search. What factory is best for making my IEMs? There is a lot of questions still that need to be answered. For example, are they reliable? Of course they have to be reliable. B, are they actually able to produce the volumes that I want? And C, which is on everyone's mind, which is quality control. All these things need to be thought of before you even start to shake hands with someone who owns the actual factory. And of course, now the question is, Crin, why don't you make your own factory? Which again, my default reaction is, bitch, what? As a guy who is in Singapore, it's going to be very difficult for me to actually build my own factory even if I wanted to. So unrealistic, I would say. So the best case scenario right now is for me to find an existing factory that already does OEMs for other brands. So let's say that you have actually found your ideal factory. They seem to do everything well and they won't seem to fuck you over at first notice. That's great. That's amazing. There's still so much to do. For example, how do you actually make an IEM that is easily producible? Because there is that fine line between let's make something that is really, really good, but really, really hard to make, and let's just slap together some shit and it's going to be the easiest thing to make, but it also sounds like shit. On the mass production front, there is really two ways that I can see how to really design an IEM. For example, if you want something that is really, really cheap, then what we have to do is something called injection-molded parts. Let's take something in my arsenal right now, which is the 7Hz Cell Notes 0. These are very, very cheap IEMs. They go for about $20 to $25 US. And the simple reason for that is that they are really, really easy to make. A way that an IEM like this is built is through a process called injection molding. First, they take a mold and then they literally inject plastic into that mold in order to create a simple shell. This process is really cheap, and what you get is a shell that costs the factory themselves cents on the dollar to make. It's basically free. But the problem with injection molding is that you can't have a complex structure out of it. So for this kind of product, it's very simple. It's really just shell with a straight hole in, and that's about it. Construction wise, it is also very simple. You put a DD in it, glue it in place, do the soldering of what is basically 2 strands of wires, and you're done. Every other parameter has been selected by the tuner himself, aka me, and then produced by the factory. Now you might be thinking to yourself, Crin, this is an amazing idea. Why don't you just use this for all your IEMs and just drive all the costs down? And the simple answer for that is, it's not that simple. First of all, when it comes to injection molded parts, they aren't really the prettiest to look at. There's a reason why cheap stuff look cheap, and that is because they are. And second of all, what people don't know is that the mold themselves actually has a cost. So before you start producing thousands, if not tens of thousands of these little IEMs, you have to pay a mold cost, which can run you, and I shit you not, tens of thousands of USD just for that initial mold. So before you even start all of this, you must have the capital. Capital for what? Well, the capital is, to tell the factory that yes, I would like to proceed with a mold. Please take my money and hopefully you can do a good job. So the age-old adage is true. You have to lose money to make money. Before you even make these kinds of cheap shit stuff, you have to invest quite a sizable sum of money. But of course, if you can predict that you're going to sell a lot, then the costs make sense. But let's say you are not someone like me who can basically guarantee a set amount of sales and can justify the cost of opening a mold. What do you do then? Here we have 2 more examples of a different way of approaching this. It's 3D printing. The true tier zeros, which includes the original zeros as well as the zero reds, the Singolo as well as the Dusk, all use a 3D printed shell. What that means is that you don't actually need to open up a mold anymore. So that's all fine and hunky-dory, isn't it, Crin? Well, if that's the case, we can just all use 3D printed shells. We don't have to pay a mold, we don't have to have capital. You can just start an IEM company right now, right? Of course, you've watched this video. Clearly, it's not that simple. With 3D printed shells, yes, you don't have to actually open up a mold anymore, but there is a flip side, and that is per shell, it is going to be much more expensive. There's a reason why the 3D printed shells tend to be slightly above in terms of the MSRP, and that's the simple fact that they just simply cost more to make. Now, when it comes to stuff like the true tier zeros, well, we can justify that with the fact that we have sold so many units, and therefore we can ask for a lower price in exchange. And that, my friends, is the concept of MOQ. MOQ stands for minimum order quantity. Whenever you order something off of a supplier, they typically would ask for you to buy a minimum amount in order to justify their work. So when it comes to 3D printed shells, you're still going to be expected to buy a few thousand shells before you even start any kind of work with them. And still, that is going to be quite a significant capital injection. But the great thing about 3D printed shells is that you could put in very complex tubing as well as acoustic stuff that you otherwise wouldn't be able to with injection molding. Which is why, again, when it comes to 3D printed shells, they typically occupy the higher end of the spectrum, where all of these kinds of complex designs tend to justify the price better. Hey, Crin from the future here. I just realized that I forgot to talk about one more thing, and that is, what if you have decided to use a metal shell instead? First, similar to the way that you would use injection molding, you could also do the same thing with metal by using die casting instead. What this means is that you have a mold and you are just shooting liquid metal in there, hardening it, and then there you have a new shell, and you can do it many times over for very low cost. But just like with injection molding, you would also have to pay for the mold cost, and unlike injection molding, it's actually a lot more expensive to pay for a die-cast mold. So yes, if you're very confident in your selling skills and if you think that you can sell thousands upon thousands of units every single month, then die casting is probably the smarter choice for you. But let's just say that you're just starting out and selling is going to be a problem for you. Then what you could do is do something called CNC. CNC machining is not new, and what it is basically cutting out the shape of the thing that you want out of a block of metal. So CNC is kind of similar to 3D printing in that regard. You don't have to open up a mold. It's much cheaper in at least the starting point, and therefore much easier to get off the ground with just CNC components. But the difference here is that with CNC, you don't have the precision of 3D printing. You kind of have the limitations of both injection molding as well as die casting. You have to have all the holes in one single plane. You can't have intricate tubings inside the shell, yada, 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 all of that. You have to take all of these into account when you think about doing a metal shell. Another technique that was common in the old days, you can just buy a pre-made metal shell, and what you do is you pull the acoustic tubing through the nozzle, and that is where you kind of put all your drivers in. It's in a similar way of how you make your own DIY IEMs with an acrylic shell. You just pull the tubings out of the nozzle and just fit the drivers that way. But you can see why this is very labor intensive, and if you're going to be making hundreds, if not thousands of units a month, this is not it. Now, some of you would probably mention the IE600 by Sennheiser, which does use a 3D printed metal shell, but this is a rather exotic technique. It's not very common, and quite frankly, it's going to be very expensive, which is why you see the IE600 is priced the way it is. Sure, there are some extra intricacies that go into the driver matching whole thing, but the main bulk of the cost goes into the metal shell. And all that I've spoken about now still hasn't gone into the cost of the materials themselves. You could go cheap and go with something like aluminium, but some people want it exotic, maybe something like titanium, stainless steel, God forbid, tungsten carbide. There are many ways of trying to approach this. Some people are just simply happy for the fact that they got a metal shell, in which case the cheapest material reigns supreme. But let's say you're going with a very high-end build, then you would have to think about a lot more different things, like for example, the design of the shell itself, how many facets it has. Does it look complicated? Does it look good? And that's not even talking about the texturing they can do on the metals themselves. You could do stuff like sandblasting, brushing, anodizing, cerakoting, plating, the list goes on. A lot of different considerations that you have to think about when it's just only about the shell. I haven't even gone into the acoustics of it all yet. So when it comes to the question of what shell do I want, it's not as easy as a one best solution that just trumps all of them. Every single little technique, every single little selection would have an impact on not just your sound, but also your final costing as well, which is something that, you know, a lot of the audiophiles don't actually see. And with that, the metals part of this section is now over. I bring you back now again to old Crinacle. Take it away. So all of this is just simply the shell. I haven't even talked about what is arguably the most important part of the IEM, which are the drivers. So here's where you have to think about driver selection. People always ask me, Crin, why don't you just make this driver configuration for this kind of cheap budget? And the final answer that I always give is that everything all depends on the cost. For example, there is a reason why you don't see Sony and ESTs occupying the budget end of the spectrum, and that is because the moment you put just one EST into an IEM, the minimum amount that you have to charge for that IEM would already be above $100 US. There's just no negotiating on that. Stuff like Sony and EST drivers are going to be very, very expensive. Even one unit is going to exceed maybe 10 or 20 US, and I'm pretty sure I'm lowballing that amount at this point. And even when it comes to approved BAs, which are BAs from the likes of NALS or even Sony, they are also quite expensive. So even if you were to be making a simple, let's say 2BA1DD hybrid IEM, costs are still going to be quite high, especially if you're going to insist that I need to use NALS or Sony drivers. There is no skirting around that. But let's say if you're someone who doesn't care about the fact that you're using approved BAs from the market, well, you could go with the cheap Chinese clones, which are controversial to say the least. As with everything in China, yes, there are replicas, there are copies that you can buy for cheap, much cheaper than their counterparts, but there also comes a risk with all of this. Back in the year of, I forget the year, NALS actually filed cease and desists for many IEM companies out there, some of which that you would actually know of. For example, FIO and Campfire Audio. They were caught with using cheap Chinese clones of Now's own BA drivers, and therefore they were sent to CNDs, told that they couldn't sell those specific models listed in the CNDs ever again. And of course, at that point was a warning shot to everyone to say that, hey, don't. But of course, all of this doesn't really matter if you aren't one of the big players. So let's say if you were just a small IEM firm, I think you could get away with using cheap Chinese clones, or even better, just cheap BAs that don't copy any existing design. Which is why you can see some of these Chinese IEMs, even with like a million BAs in them, they can still charge like under $100 for them. Why? Because they're just so cheap for them, at least. But I'd like all of you to think about the Crinacle litmus test, if you will. What if Crinacle released this product? And I would think that many of you would be very disapproving if I released a product with cheap Chinese clone drivers. So there is that balancing act that you have. Do you want to make a cheap value for money product, or do you want to make something that is approved and with high quality components? You get what I mean? And even if you want to make something cheap, like let's say dynamic driver IEMs, even then there comes a significant cost, because dynamic driver IEMs aren't easy to actually develop. With dynamic drivers, it's not as simple as going to a company like Now's or Sony, and there's not really a defined dynamic driver factory, if you make sense. And the problem with testing dynamic drivers is that there are just so many on the market right now. It is really just trial and error, finding the best driver for your specific use case. And if you can't find it, you simply just can't find it. It's very hard to actually have a relationship with the factory and to make your own drivers. And then there still are the other little components that you still have to pay attention to. For example, there's going to be filters that you have to put on your IEMs, or even stuff like a 2-pin connection, MMCX connection, all of which still costs money. And that's not even talking about the things that are just outside the IEM itself. For example, the cable, the ear tip, the accessories, the packaging, all of which, yes, costs money, not only in materials, but also to design. And let's just say you have finally developed your own IEM. Everything is spick and span. Perfect. You have your packaging, you have your IEM, you have your cables, you have your production line. You still have to worry about distribution, because now you have to think to yourself, all right, I've ordered, let's say 5,000 of these IEMs as a MOQ, for example. Where the fuck are you going to store all of those? How are you going to sell all of those? Who's going to sell it for you? All of these things still have to be considered before you even start your IEM company. Again, let's just assume you're an absolute nobody in the scene. Not everyone is Crinacle here. You don't know anyone who can distribute for you, and even then you still have to bake in distribution margins, because you can't just tell people, hey, sell my product for free. So before you start pricing your products, you have to think about, okay, let's say my distributor needs like, I don't know, 40%, 50%, like something like that. You still have to bake a little bit for yourself, right? Maybe 10 or 20%, maybe even more. So what, let's say, would cost you $20 to make, just to make, would probably balloon up to, let's say, $100 the moment you start considering about distribution and resellers and God knows what other costs there might be. So let's say you have established someone who can be your global distributor. That's great. That's amazing. All you have to do is just throw the stock to them and just tell them, hey, all of this is yours. Select your own regional distributors, your own resellers, and get the whole thing out of your hair. That's the easy way out. But let's say you don't want the easy way out, because at that point people would say that you're lazy for whatever reason. Then you have to become your own distributor, in which case you have to think about, again, other things that otherwise you wouldn't have to care about. For example, shipping fees, taxes, like specific regional taxes for imports, and stuff like warranties, because people are going to return the products, no matter how good they are. Then at that point, you have to think about, okay, what if I want to sell on Amazon? What if I want to sell on AliExpress, onto Shopee, onto Lazada? All of these different platforms have different terms, have different fees, and all of which would just make you tear your hair out. So if you want to make less money but less stress, then yes, just select a distributor that can do all of this for you. You just make less money. If you want more money, then you can do all of these nitty-gritty things yourself. But again, it really is a lot of work. So when people ask me, why don't you do your own brand? I say it's really a nuanced discussion. I'm not saying that I don't want to. I'm trying. I'm really trying. But there is a lot of work. There really is a lot of work. On the flip side, if you really think about it, there is a reason why collaborations are gaining a lot of traction. And the simple answer for that is, it is so easy. When you collaborate with a brand, you don't have to worry about upfront capital injection. They usually tank all of these costs for you. You don't have to worry about the molding costs. You don't have to worry about MOQ. All you have to do is just sit there with your pretty face and say, hey, I made this product, promote it, buy it, whatever. These brands will also typically have their own global distributors, some of which would be fairly obvious. For example, with Truthyear or Moondrop, it would be Shenzhen Audio. With Kiwi Ears, it would be Linsol, and with 7Hz, also kind of Linsol. You get my point. When these brand to distribution relationships happen, it simply means that everything is settled for you. You don't have to worry about selling to different countries. You don't have to worry about MOQ. You don't have to worry about literally anything. Just promote, right? And therein kind of lies the solution as well as the problem to all of these over collaborations, if you will. They're easy. There's very little risk that the collaborator actually takes, which I can fully admit myself. And all in all, is actually a fairly elegant solution to what I think is a deep problem in audio for the longest time. And that is us, the common man, the common hobbyist, didn't really have a voice in the production scene until now. Back then, you could just say like, oh, I hate this IEM, it's shit. And then the company just says, okay, next. Whereas now you could be like, hey, this product is shit, I can make it better, and it would sell better. And the company would be like, go on, let's try it out. And so we went from what I think to be the generic Chi-Fi V-shape into what I think is a fairly good refinement of a lot of different target curves. You could have Harman IEMs if you want to. You could have diffuse tilted IEMs if you want to. It's a much more varied scene and varied in a what I think to be a much better way. Are collaborations bad? I think that is a much more nuanced discussion that I would probably make in a separate video. Again, the video that this covers would be how hard it is to make your own IEM brand or IEM company. And again, the answer is it's very difficult. There's a lot to think about. So I leave it at that. If people continue to ask why does Crinacle only do collabs, why doesn't he start his own IEM company? The simple answer is collabs are so much easier. Starting your own brand is hard, and I have been trying for the last 2 years with mixed success. Let's not put it mixed success. It's all been failures. There's a reason why I don't have one right now. But yeah, the other underlying pretext that you can gain out of all of this is that ya boy here would be eventually running his own IEM brand. When is that? I don't know. Do you want me to say soon? Soon. It's soon. Maybe. And that is it. Here are all of your names. You have subscribed to the $20 tier on my Patreon. And for those who have subscribed to my $30 tier, behold, Dennis, McMadface, Crinacle, Andrew, Posichronic, Light Pizza, Seraphim, Chemotherapy, Daryl, and Spooky Hedgehog. I thank you all. There's so many projects happening on the back end, so many things that I want to do, including my own IEM brand, but I'm really only one guy. But with that in mind, see you next week. And don't die. Fuck off.